was a junior in high school when this was taken.
Where was that taken?
At the school. A studio came down there and took the class pictures.
Where was that one?
This was at my grandmother's chambers there in Sanders. See, that's my grandfather sitting back there with a pipe in his mouth.
So
that's Paul Chambers. Okay, this is my dad and his oldest sister, Opal. And Opal was about 18 months older than my dad. This one is Olive, my dad's sister. She's the one that taught school for so many years. This is his next sister, Doris. And my dad is holding Douglas, his youngest brother. And Douglas is 10 years younger than my dad, the same distance between them as there is me and my youngest brother, Steve. And this is their cousin, Robert McVeigh. And then over here was my Aunt Bonnie. And for some reason, this picture's been broken. And on the other side should have been the one they called Tiny. Her name was Ella. And then in later years, they had Nancy. This was before Nancy was born.
And that was taken where?
That was taken at my grandparents' house there on Allen's Creek.
All right.
Okay, this is my granddad, Elmer Eads, and Hulda, my grandmother. And I'm sure this picture was taken at my aunt and uncle's, because after all these years, I can remember that wallpaper. And I would say they're probably in their 70s in this picture. It was before they moved to Sanders. That's my grandma and grandpa Eads, Elmer, and Hulda. Hulda was a McVeigh before she was married. And I have no idea how those two got together because she came from an entirely different type family from ours. My grandfather had always been raised on a farm and lived on a farm all of his life. And she came from a people that were more educated and moved to the country with him and stayed there the rest of her life. And I don't know how she made that transition, but she did real well with it.
Do you know where that was taken?
That was also taken at Elms Creek, and they were probably, I would guess they were about 40, mid-40 when that was taken. They were rather young. Hold this mom and dad. And who has that picture? Do you know that was a 10 type? Did you know that? That picture was a 10 type, and 2 or 3 of my cousins have tried to trace that down as to where it was, and I had no idea where it was. This is the first time I've seen it since my mom and dad's been gone. I can remember her talking about her grandma Sibby.
Alfred T. Shackelford, and I found that on Ancestry also.
Is that right? And look at his coloring. Let me tell you.
That had to be taken in the
1800s.
mid-1800s.
Yeah, that'd be. This is my daughter Shannon when she was 9.5 months old, and we were at my mother's when this was taken. And the photographer came to the house and took that. The photographers used to come around the house a lot in the summertime, and you wouldn't even know they were coming to see if you wanted a picture taken, and that's what happened that day. And I happened to be there and had hers done.
Did you say she dropped something?
Oh, yes, she dropped a teething ring down in the front of the bib of her little suit here just about the time they took the picture. So I don't know if that was a smile or what kind of a reaction that is on her face. It turned out real cute, though. She was a pretty baby, real pretty. This is my grandma Chambers' parents. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
And he passed in 1933. 1856. But see, this was a year after I was born, and this was a year before.
No, just funny stories about your dad.
Well, we never had a bathroom the entire time I was home. They never had a bathroom until after I had moved away from home. And one summer my mom had just gone to work, and we had to dig a new toilet pit. So my brothers dug the pit, and my dad and I had big long pieces of limestone that he had gathered over a period of 2 or 3 years because he worked around the quarries at that time. So one Sunday while my mother was at work, she didn't work Sundays often, but she did that week, and he and I laid that limestone up, and he stood in the hole while I carried the limestone to him. That thing laid up, and then he and I both shoved the toilet over onto the new hole and covered the old one up. That was my Sunday afternoon.
How old were you?
I think I was 12. By the way, the toilet hole was right down close to the pig pen. We had two pigs in the backyard. Another time we had a very small chicken house, and chicken park was real small because our house sat on probably a half acre. Very small for a family of 8. And our chickens got lice. So so my dad went out and got sheep dip and put it in a lard can and took those chickens and dipped them in. He'd hold them by the legs and dip them in there and then throw them back in the chicken park. Then the next day, Mother and I had to go down and take the same sheep dip and an old broom and paint the inside of the chicken with that sheep dip in case there was any lice left in the building. Now, I don't.
Sheep dip made out of?
It's whatever they used to dip sheep in, and you would buy it at the Farm Bureau at that time. I have no idea. The only thing I know is how bad it smelled. And let's see, we had a.
Did it do the job?
Oh yeah. We had a neighbor that had chickens, and they had one huge rooster, and that rooster run loose. And we'd always throw out scraps in the evening from where we'd had a meal. And of course, first thing the big old rooster would do would be run up that direction to see if anyone had thrown out any scraps for the evening. I think that's where he ate most of his meals. And if the kids was out in the yard, that thing was so mean that it would try to spur you. It'd jump up in the air and throw its spurs at you. And about 3, and my dad was always afraid that big rooster would spur him, maybe hit him in the face. So he decided we'd try to get rid of the rooster.
Rooster belonged to your neighbor?
Yeah, rooster belonged to a neighbor. His name was Eads too, but they always told me he wasn't any relation to this day. I don't really know. I think he might have been. Anyway, we took bread and turpentine and soaked it and fed that rooster, and he stood there and eat all of it, and all of a sudden he started back home, and he wobbled and he'd fall over, and he'd get up and he'd flop over all the way home. My dad thought sure he would die, and next morning he's right back to eat breakfast.
So he never did die.
I think he died of old age. I can't remember. Dad took Kent, my older brother. There was 14 months difference in us, and Wes was 2 years younger. I mean, I was probably 5, Kent close to 7, and Wes was a little guy. He took us in an old car over in the woods where there was a huge grapevine. I mean huge. And we picked 2 tubs of grapes. 2 tubs. And I didn't know why we was picking grapes. We'd never had grapes at home. So we took them home. And my dad put them in another tub. He washed them, put them in another tub. And we took our hands and went down in there with our hands and mashed those grapes to make wine. And at the time, I didn't know what we were doing. So he had a huge crock. Now, I do mean a huge, but it probably held, I don't know, probably 20 gallon. And he put all those grapes in there. And this was while my mom was at work on a Saturday. Put all those grapes in there and set them in behind a chair in the living room. And in front of the chair was the heating stove that we heated the house with. So about 4 days later, my mom come through the house and she said, something in here does not smell right. So she started looking, and she'd go in the other room and she'd say, well, I can't smell it in here. When she come back to the living room and she found that big crock full of grape stuff, and she let us know how she felt about it. But I guess you have to keep that stuff warm until it ferments. And he insisted on keeping it in there for a few more days until after it fermented. Then after it did, then he took it out to out in the shed. I don't know, coal shed or whatever it was, smokehouse, because the other end was a coal shed. Let it sit out there for another month and it into big jugs, and I don't know where the jugs came from, but it's something that he'd come across. And Kent West and I also helped that day, and he had this big siphoning hose coming from the crock, and he'd set the crock up on a table that was pretty high. So when he'd siphon the jug about full, we'd bend the hose up real tight, and then when he turned his head, we'd put it in our mouth to see what it tastes like. It wasn't very good, but we went ahead and drank a little of it. Anyway, that was my first and only experience ever making wine. And it was 25 years later that I still remembered him having some of that wine because we made a lot of jugs of it. The only time I ever remember making any kind of wine or anything. He was quite a character. In his latter years, he would call me, maybe not see what I was doing. I'd say, I'm sitting here watching TV. He'd say, I said, what are you doing? He'd say, sitting on the front porch. Why don't you come up for a while? 10 o'clock at night. So I'd jump in the car and run up there and maybe stay till midnight. Some nights he'd say, won't you run and get us some donuts? And we'd just sit and talk, and he'd tell me about the old days. And I do remember going to bootleggers with him when I couldn't have been more than 5 to buy a bootleg for someone else. And the guy that we bought it for came and picked it up.